Hello, and welcome to our case presentation for today. So today we'll be covering the Tomato Good Agricultural Practices, also known as TGAPs. To talk with us today, we have Dr. Keith Schneider and Dr. Karuna Karel. Dr. Keith Schneider is from the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at the University of Florida. And Dr. Karel is his postdoc in the same department. And we're excited today to learn more about TGAPs and how this has influenced the food industry.
Good afternoon. If we're ready, actually, we'll just kind of walk through some of the slides that we have made. So today we're going to talk about the Tomato Good Agricultural Practices program, and many of you are probably familiar with GAPs, Good Agricultural Practices, and may or may not be that aware of a specific GAPs program that we have here in Florida, which is called TGAPs. And the first thing I'm going to do is a little bit of history. So a couple of decades ago, I'm going to date myself because I remember these, Florida was having a rough time of it. They were having a foodborne outbreak associated with tomatoes grown in the state every single year, or sometimes twice a year. And you can see here that there's just a bunch of these outbreaks. The pathogen of concern was Salmonella. That's the S you see there. There's about 2,500 different strains of Salmonella out there, and they're typically given the names like you see: Javiana, Newport. You might have heard of Salmonella typhimurium, or Salmonella enteritidis. Just things that make people sick. And in many cases, not only sick, but people ended up in the hospital, or they even died. And you see the case deaths associated with this. And while there are many cases, there's only a few deaths, but even one or two can be detrimental. This ends at 2006. And at this particular point, probably about 5 years back now, the industry was really starting to get worried. Every time there was an outbreak, they'd have to recall the production for several, and that would shut down production for several months, and they were losing lots and lots of money. So what the industry decided to do was to get together and say, we're not going to wait to let the government regulate us. We're going to regulate ourselves. So they approached the University of Florida. They approached the Florida Department of Agriculture and said, hey, help us make a set of rules that all of our growers will follow, and we can try to get rid of these outbreaks. We can't continue going down this path. We're losing too much money. We're facing litigation every single year. We're losing packers because they're getting sued out of existence. We need to take control of our industry. And that's what happened. This is rare. Typically, things happen, and then most people wait for the government, FDA, or the state departments of health, somebody to come in and force them to do something. The Tomato Good Agricultural Practices program was sort of the first of its kind. I'm going to tell you about one other program in just a bit, but this was one of the first food safety rules associated with produce that actually had legal weight behind it. A couple of years before the adoption of TGAPs, which occur written 2005, adopted 2006, 2007, and then implemented or enforced a year later. But what it said was, we're going to institute these set of rules, and we really wasn't any guide. I was part of that planning program, and we looked to the only other program in the country at the time. A few years before that, the Western growers were having problems with leafy greens. Things like basil and lettuce and romaine, those types of things. And they were having problems with E. coli. And technically, they still are. You might have heard about E. coli or pathogenic E. coli in the news associated with leafy greens out in the West Coast. And what they did is they adopted something known as a leafy greens marketing agreement. And what it did was set a set of rules in place to safely produce produce. Sort of sounds like TGAP. The only difference was this is a marketing agreement. Basically, if you don't do this, nothing bad happens to you. You just can't sell under our banner. And really, at that point, if you weren't selling under the marketing agreement, you didn't really have a chance to sell into any of the large buyers. So pretty much everybody kind of conformed to that. What Florida did was actually call Florida Department of Agriculture and said, hey, we want you to enforce this against us so everybody takes it seriously. And when we put that in place, this was really the first commodity in the country. So you name every other piece of produce that was actually grown under a set of rules for the purpose of food safety and protecting the health of the public. And that's sort of groundbreaking. We have the produce safety rule now, which you may have heard of, which is safe manufacturing or harvesting or growing practices for produce that kind of covers all the produce that's eaten raw in the US. But before that existed, TGAPs existed for about 5 years before the produce safety rule, which was part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, was ever signed into law. So kudos to Florida for sort of leading the way, and for the Western growers who put together the leafy greens marketing agreement. The industry said, hey, we have a problem, we're going to fix it. So again, the goal is real simply, we just make the tomatoes safer. They want to minimize the contamination, train the farmers and the workers at all levels, and to ensure that when they're growing, their irrigation water is clean, personnel hands are washed, the facilities are sanitized, and to do all those things under good agricultural practices that makes products safe. Now, they did realize that if in fact they did this, they were going to put a lot of small growers under a lot of pressure. For a large grower to implement these rules, it's again, it hurts financially, but the small growers, it's really tough. So what they did is, as long as you didn't sell more than 2 25-pound boxes to any one customer at any one time, you wouldn't have to meet these regulations. You'd still have to grow things safely, but you didn't have to be inspected. And again, you didn't have to follow all the rules associated with TGAP. So they realized that small farmers had some difficulty producing or putting the manpower behind food safety. And honestly, even the new rule, the produce safety rule, has the Hagen-Tester amendment that, again, allows small growers to be exempt from regulations. No one wants to put mom and pop out of business. So if small farming operations and home farming operations are not covered, this is one of those things where they wanted to get those producers who would have the most amount of impact to the growing community or the consuming community. The other one was sort of a Good Samaritan rule, is if you made a charitable donation, that they weren't going to be subject to this rule. Again, they didn't want the charities receiving food donations to dry up, and the risk of somebody dying from hunger versus dying from tomatoes was probably greater. And they realized that, and again, they wanted to keep food flowing to those institutions, so they let them off the hook as well. So TGAPs, just the next 2 slides are really just a bunch of different rules. As Dr. Carell knows, these are just standard GAP protocols, right? These are the things that we worry about. And if you're growing anything in the farm, you want to prevent or minimize risk. And typically when we talk about risk, it's pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites, from washing into the fields, from maybe a nearby cattle or some type of animal operation nearby. There are some risks.
Soil amendments.
Yeah, soil amendments, biological soil amendments of animal origin, manures or improperly composted manures. So want to minimize those. Want to make sure the water that we use, is safe. No cows standing in the water or birds, excessive animal activity. You really can't keep birds and stuff out of ponds if you're using surface water. But if I'm using a well, you want to make sure that well is intact. Workers washing their hands. It's funny, if you look at the general public as opposed to food workers and farmers and folks, the average man in the world or in the US washes their hands only 50% of the time, or 50% of the men only wash their hands after using the restroom,
Ooh,
which is
that's gross.
it really is, isn't it? And I'm going to put Ashley and Dr. Corral on the spot. How often do you think women do it?
Please let it be at least 80%.
Me. Try
If
again.
not more, if not more.
That's what we would like to do. It's around 70, and it really depends on the population. Like the nursing community is all about hand washing, right? But again, about maybe 70%. So again, just getting workers to wash their hands after using the restroom was critical. And that was one of the big things, and how do you do that? Well, again, you gotta provide porta potties in the field, give them the opportunity to do well. And that was, that instituted, not only the mandating of like porta potties in the field, close enough so the workers would use them, but, putting hand washing sinks on the outside so people can actually see the workers after using the restroom wash their hands. And, nothing groundbreaking, but again, it really help change the mindset. Making sure all fertilizers and pesticides were used correctly. Again, we don't want a chemical hazard by overusing these things. So as long as people follow the label registrations, which are set out by EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, they would be safe because, again, they were approved to be safe at a certain level. So making sure that happened. Making sure the harvest crews, again, make them aware of what the risks are. I mean, if they see feces in the field, and you're always going to have animal scat in the field, don't step in it. 2, don't harvest product that's either touching it or nearby. If there's bird feces on a harvestable piece of produce, don't harvest that one or that bush. So educating the workers was a big thing as well. Making sure the containers, the bins and the buckets that they use were cleaned regularly, and it doesn't even say how often. I mean, it could be once a day, it could be once a week. They just want to make sure that they have an idea of, or at least they're on some type of schedule to clean those things. Cleaning and sanitizing the equipment in the plant. Getting rid of damaged fruit, and that was a huge one. A lot of the migrant workers are paid by the piece, so they'd fill up their buckets as fast as possible because, again, they're only getting 45 cents a bucket or something like that. And maybe they weren't quite as careful about, if they had a damaged piece or scratch or something with a defect in it. But by removing those defective or culled or ones that should be culled, that reduces the potential for pathogens. So that was a good idea too. It did prohibit field packing, which is kind of weird. Field packing is pretty much allowed even under the new regulation, but in Florida, because they were they really couldn't guarantee that it was going to be done safely. And what they wanted to do was wanted the tomatoes to go through some type of sanitizer step. And this mandated, the fluming or washing in a certain amount of sanitizer. And the one that we most often use is like a chlorine base. Sometimes we use a peroxyacetic acid based sanitizer. And those tests were done early on with in laboratories like Salmonella and for plant pathogens such as Awinia, which is sometimes you'll see in certain books or articles as Pectobacterium. Made you keep records. That was a good thing. And then requires safe water for dilution of the pesticide. Really, you can't use pond water to mix up your chemistry. You needed to use well water. Dr. Corral is more familiar with Louisiana than Florida. What are some of the practices that you saw? I mean, I can name 100 practices that were out there that were not great when all this was starting.
When we were interacting with growers there, they're like small to medium sized scale growers, and so they were harvesting those tomatoes and then packing it on a shed, like, and then the nearby in the farm itself. And so I've seen them using wash water, but as you said, with the sanitizers in there. So that was a good practice. And I've also seen that they've tried to like minimize not the birds flying over, trying to check off any wildlife, or even domesticated animals. They have it like in a secured place. They are trying to make sure that they're not coming into the packing facility and preventing those cross contaminations. So I've seen those things, but also one of the things like I guess I'm not trying to go into the nitty gritty, but looking at the anatomy of tomato, like because how the tomato is shaped and some parts like they are better colonized by bacteria, right? Like the pedicels and calyx where they're like more susceptible, where by the research also we've seen that those are the areas where bacteria loves to grow, basically. And so those are and if we see like we harvest tomatoes at a later stage in terms of like consumer acceptance because we want them ripe. And so during those times when you're trying to transport those ripe tomatoes, there's like mechanical injury as opposed to something that's raw and very intact and very tight. So these are like several different factors that affects any contamination, cross-contamination, or even internalization of the produce. So definitely like all these measures and steps that are in the TGAPs, they are very essential to prevent, eliminate from any of those bacterial or biological hazards.
So I gave you kind of a brief history overview of all this. Around 2007, 2008, this is really starting to be enforced. You saw all the outbreaks, and right now we're in 2023. Last major outbreak, again, I'm going to pick on Dr. Corral and and Ashley. When do you think the last outbreak was?
With the tomatoes?
Yeah. Five years ago?
Yeah, somewhere 2015, 2016.
Right about 2007, 2008. There was one attributed to Florida 2008. Really wasn't Florida. It was actually Serrano peppers. So now, is there a direct correlation? The fact that we put TGAPs in and we really haven't a major outbreak since? We can't really prove that statistically, but what has happened is we haven't had a major outbreak with tomatoes since TGAPs has been put in place. So that I have to attribute to, at least in part, to the farmers really paying attention and following the rules. So that was a good thing. It is, again, it does raise the cost for the farmers. It is a lot of work, but again, I think the benefit is they haven't been plagued by those outbreaks that were happening every year and every or sometimes twice a year. We still have recalls. We still worry about other things that are post-harvest, but pre-harvest contamination of tomatoes, honestly, has dropped to a very low level. And I think it's one of the progenitors of the new rule. If you look at the Leafy Greens marketing agreement and TGAPs, these were the two pilot programs really for the rest of the country. It showed that if you could put something in place that would have a positive effect. And by educating not only, well, consumers as well, but the producers, the workers in the field, and the folks, even in the harvesting crews, just getting them to take these training courses goes a long way in protecting the consuming public. So right now we're still operating under TGAPs. We also have the produce safety rule, which is a federal rule. TGAPs is a state rule. And we're constantly doing research for the industry here in the state of Florida and really around the country. Michelle Danlock, who couldn't be with us today, my partner in crime, as I call her, she has a very large research grant that Dr. Carell and I work on for her. We're doing field research right now. Some of our students are out in the field collecting samples, trying to, again, continually improve the safety of the produce that we eat. We meet with the tomato industry on an annual basis. We have a training update, educational event every year in September. And we also do a lot of post-harvest safety, or excuse me, produce safety rule training, between 30 and 40 workshop events every year. So that's a brief history. of the TGAPS program in Florida and the effect that it's had.
I had a
Be happy to
question.
answer any questions.
Yeah, Keith, so have any other states adopted TGAPS and made it also a rule for their state?
No, everybody kind of pointed the finger and laughed at Florida for like, you know, making it more difficult. Like, thank you for making it, it's much easier to compete against, and it really did. I mean, all the Florida companies had to do more work. And you could be up in the panhandle of Florida, and your farmer, a couple of miles north of you, who just happened to be in Georgia, could produce tomatoes cheaper than you could just 5 miles south of them around Quincy, because they didn't have to follow the state regulations. They weren't going to be inspected by the state. But yet Florida endured. I think we've seen positive benefits due to the lack of outbreaks. Again, outbreaks affect everybody, just not the company that's selling them. If there's an outbreak in tomatoes for one packer, nobody's going to be selling tomatoes that's somewhere from Florida. So it affects everybody. And that's why the industry got together and put this rule in place. What did happen, though, is that I think people noticed that when these programs like the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, the LGMA, and the TGAPS program were put in place, positive things happened. And that, I think, led people to realize that, we can do this for other commodities. And several years later, in 2011, the Produce Safety Rule, which is part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, was signed into law. 5 years later, it was enacted, and it's still being evolved today. I think yesterday, like water compliance, 12 years after the fact, just started to be enforced. And we still are waiting on biological soil amendments to be resolved. So research is constantly being done. But the big program that everybody's, working with now is that produce safety rule. And really, I think that's the child of those other two programs.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you, Dr. Schneider and Dr. Carell, for joining us today for the TGAPS case presentation. It's very informative, learned a lot. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact Dr. Schneider, Dr. Carell, or Michelle Danieluk at these respective emails. And have a great day.
Thank you. Really enjoyed this session.